Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you this morning?
Doing fine, doing fine. We're going to follow up, as we always do, on what's going on in the world, in particular with the COVID mendacity, the mess that is involved there. So we'll be talking about that. But yesterday we had a show talking about, a few breakthroughs. Of course, we're ruling favorably, and we have a little bit of that. But we also have what we suspected could happen, the buckling down of the opposition. They're not going to give up and walk away. I've always argued that case. They're going to do everything, no matter how badly they do. They're going to come up with it. And if they think they need more than just lying and innuendos, they're going to use force. But right now, our job is just to try to keep the discussion going on where we think the problems are. And now that we have the Omicron virus, that's a big thing. And it's a big thing for an excuse, is the way I see it. It's the excuse for continuing this monstrosity. It's not an excuse to get frightened like they frighten a lot of people. The markets are shaky. One thing is the markets are confused too, because some days they go sky high and the next day they go right down again. But it's the people trying to scare everybody. That's the problem. So right now, we have noticed that it hasn't slowed the president down any at all on more regulations on the American people. And the one thing he's doing now is working on traveling. And it's been I've sort of blame myself a little bit for ever dealing with the TSA. The only way I dealt with them was I tried to prevent them from coming into existence. But I put up with them when I was going back and forth to Washington, and that's sort of giving them an inch. And a lot of people are doing that now, and it will continue. But right now, though, they want to expand it. You'd think because they're losing some of these cases, they'd back off and not be so bold. But now they're laying down more travel, restrictions. So the TSA and probably OSHA and everybody else they can think of, the FBI and whomever. So this is going to continue. So today, Daniel, I want to talk a little bit about these travel restrictions. Do you think there's going to be a chance that they'll give up on this, or shall we all be better prepared? Already, my preparation has been, I'm boycotting. I'm on strike. I do not fly commercial airlines. So I like to go places. I like to go to speaking engagement, but I'm going to have to get there a different way because that's where I drew my red line. It's Daniel.
Yeah, and it apparently, and this is a Washington Post article that's been reported by other organizations, that the administration is planning on Thursday, which is tomorrow, to unveil new travel restrictions on Americans and foreigners. So even Americans, if you're overseas, they're expected to demand and force you to take a COVID test regardless of your vaccination status. That's interesting. They make no distinction between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated in these requirements to take a COVID test before coming to the United States. And it's a strange sort of admission in a way, if you think about it, that these shots must not be all that good if you've got to be treated the same way as an unvaxxed person. But here's the really controversial part, Dr. Paul. They are reportedly also debating requiring anyone who comes to the U.S. from overseas, foreigners and Americans, to quarantine for 7 days upon arrival. And this would be some of the most draconian measures certainly ever attempted in the U.S. And it almost reminds you of something out of Australia. What are they going to do? Are they going to deploy millions of soldiers, making sure that as soon as you get to the U.S., you have to self-quarantine? The whole thing is so unbelievably unworkable and completely and totally insane. If this administration itself wasn't so insane, we'd be laughing at it. But as you pointed out, Dr. Paul, in your opening segment, the more they lose in the courts, and we'll talk about this in our second segment on the program today, the more they lose in the courts, the more they seem to be doubling down elsewhere with the new excuse that the Omicron variant is so dangerous and deadly, when in fact nothing is known about it. And as we reported yesterday, some experts believe that actually might kill COVID because it has so many mutations that it's so transmissible, but also not, at least what the Africans are reporting, South Africans, it's not very deadly. In fact, it's like a minor cold. So they're doubling down, Dr. Paul, and this idea of turning the U.S., of bringing internment camps in for travelers, well, that's going to do wonders for the travel industry, isn't it?
Right, that's for sure. You know, they're back to their old tricks. They haven't learned anything because they're doing the same thing. The questions that we raised and a lot of other people raised at the very beginning was the reliability of the test. And I still don't believe the tests are reliable. You know, you can't get accurate information, and there's a lot of different tests. I think when they're doing these millions and millions of tests, I don't think there's any record kept. Which tests are they talking about? How many were doing that? Who kept the records of these? And so now they're depending on it. 3 days before you travel, they're going to do another test, and it's going to be dependent on. And then they want to go, well, this will be the test will make the decision on whether somebody should be quarantined. So they're back to testing, which is unreliable. Then they're back to quarantine, which is not reliable. And pretty soon it's a form of special restrictions letting the people go. But this is a real setback. So I hope our friends in the courts that have been helpful so far, I hope they continue. So, but right now, those in charge, and sometimes I think some people who are supposed to be in charge, and they might have a public position that they are in charge, they might not really be in charge. You know, who's really pulling the strings? And sometimes there's a lot of people who question the fact of whether or not the president is really up to speed on all this, but nevertheless, in his name, these regulations are pushed back and it's restrictions. And, you know, it just was because they violate a basic rule of liberty, and that is in a free society, interaction between individuals socially and economically should be done voluntarily by both sides. What a simple little test that would have solved a lot of problems in this monstrosity that we've been dealing with for the past 2 years.
If there's anything that we know now, Dr. Paul, it's how unhinged so-called public health experts are and how incapable they are of seeing the bigger picture. We talked a little bit about Scott Atlas yesterday in his new book, and hopefully we'll get him on the show. But he pointed out in the book, at least from the review that Jeffrey Tucker wrote, that when Atlas was in the room in these White House coronavirus briefings, he said not a single other so-called experts said a single thing when they talked about the most extreme measures like lockdowns, etc. So you don't have any pushback from these people because they don't live in the real world. And here's an example from the Washington Post article that we just referenced. Celine Gounder, she's a Biden COVID advisor, and here's what she said in the article. If it were up to me, you should be fully vaccinated and should also be testing 24 hours prior to flight. She wants an absolute vax mandate and testing mandate before anyone flies on any plane. And that just shows how extreme it is. But it also, again, from what I said in the beginning, Dr. Paul, it's also kind of a strange admission that the vaccines aren't very good. I mean, I think even the average person would realize, oh, hang on, why should you have to be tested if you've been vaccinated? What are you suggesting here? So there's so many contradictions in what they're saying, but the only thing they do know how to do, Dr. Paul, is to clamp tighter with that iron fist.
You know, we have to continue to show our concern about the imperfections, and what they're talking about is what science. You know, if we say something they disagree with, we're unscientific, and we have to obey the science, the mandates. But the real problem I see it, or one of the most major, and that is the authoritarianism. They dictate. They have the answers, and you're not even allowed to discuss it. That's where our real problem is. But this is a sad affair if they're going to continue to do it. So let's hope, you know, that more and more cases will come about. And I think in a minute now, Daniel, we want to talk a little bit about these few successes that have continued.
Yeah, they have, Dr. Paul. And there's another one, and our colleague Adam Dick wrote about it yesterday as well in Kentucky. We've talked about, okay, we know that the Fifth Circuit has completely wiped out the 100 employee plus mandate. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about these 10 states who sued the federal government over the mandate that health workers with Medicaid and Medicare must be vaccinated. And not only right after those 10 states were victorious, another judge, federal judge in Louisiana, enjoined it to the entire country. So the entire country now, the mandate for these health workers has been overturned. And now what we saw late in the day yesterday is a federal judge in Kentucky who overturned the requirement of the administration that anyone who contracts with the federal government must be vaccinated. So these are serious, serious body blows. It's really almost a death by 1,000 cuts. And I've read some of these rulings, and they're very, very tight and very, very specific on why the president has completely overreached his authority.
Right. I want to read the names of the states that first filed that suit, that it got expanded to include the whole nation, because it just happens that they're red states. They are run by Republican governors. And it challenges my assumption, and my position is that one of the major problems we have in Washington is that there's really no contest, that the parties are so much alike. And somebody could use this against me and say, what do you mean? Look, you just said there are 10 states, there are Republican states, they filed it. And I do think you have to say there are differences. I still maintain, though, when it comes to the Federal Reserve and foreign policy deficits, they're very much on the same page. But I want to read the names of the state, because this has probably the political significance, for next year, which is the thing that's occupying a lot of people's mind right now. But the states that brought the attorney generals, their attorney generals brought these cases to court: Louisiana, Montana, Arizona, Alabama, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Utah, and West Virginia. They're all Republicans. So I think there is a difference. So at the same time, I will maintain my position that we have to be alert that you're not going to change foreign policy or deficit financing, the welfare state, attack on civil liberties if you think the Republicans are going to solve our problem. But when the Republicans do get together and try to put the brakes on it, I mean, we have to recognize this, just who is doing the most harm to us at the present time.
Yes, and we've talked a lot about some victories we've had in the courts, and they've been surprising and uplifting. We're not seeing a lot of activity in Congress, though. We're not seeing a lot of leadership against these Biden mandates. Of course, they're too busy playing footsie with each other. And there are a few standouts like Thomas Massie, of course, and Senator Paul. But overall, the Republicans seem to be asleep. They could be leading a lot more. But I wanted to read a little passage here, Dr. Paul, because it's a little bit long, but I think it's really fascinating. This is Judge Shelp, and he's the one who ruled on the Medicare and Medicaid overturning the requirements. And this is an interesting, listen to this rationale. He said, in general, the overwhelming lack of evidence likely shows CMS, which is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, it's in the suit, had insufficient evidence to mandate vaccination on the wide range of facilities that it did. Looking even beyond the evidence deficiencies related to the specific facilities covered, the lack of data regarding vaccination status and transmissibility in general is concerning. Again, lack of data regarding vaccination status and transmissibility. And then he goes on to say, indeed, CMS states that, quote, the effectiveness of the vaccines to prevent disease transmission by those vaccinated is not currently known, quote unquote. That's from the CMS itself. Said CMS also admits that the continued efficacy of the vaccine is uncertain. The judge's ruling continues, and here's just one more sentence. No one questions that protecting patients and healthcare workers from contracting COVID is a laudable objective, but the court cannot, in good faith, allow CMS to enact an unprecedented mandate that lacks a rational connection between the facts found and the choice made. And if you read that and you think about it and listen to that over again, that is a devastating blow to the whole concept of not just forced vaccination, but these particular shots themselves. And this is a judge saying it, not us.
Well, I'm going to bring to attention to our audience and our viewers of somebody on Wall Street, very well known. And you think, well, Wall Street, aren't they free market capitalists and for personal liberty? Well, this one comes, and the headline is on Zero Hedge. Jim Cramer demands that Biden imposed military enforced vaccine mandates for all Americans. And that doesn't fit the scenario of people believing the people on Wall Street. I think most of our viewers, Daniel, already realize that there's a lot of people out there making a lot of money that aren't believers in the free market. Matter of fact, maybe the richer they get, the less respect they have for personal liberty. But he wants to use the military force to do this. It has to be done before January 1st. Well, this is just a little bit crazy. But Jim's program on television called Mad Money. Well, I think this is mad vaccine dictates right now is to do this. Fortunately, I don't think that's going to go through. And I would have to assume that I don't know what political party he stands for, but I don't think he was championing the cause of moving it slightly away from what we're talking about. So I don't think this is significant, but it just shows you how people are all over the place on trying to understand this. So there's an understanding on picking stocks, and I have no idea how successful he is, but that's a little bit different than an understanding what the principles of liberty really are.
You know, it was an unhinged rant, and I watched it. First of all, he sounded like he was under the influence of something. I'm not sure what he has with his lunch, but he certainly was slurring his words quite a bit. And he sort of, the look in his eyes was that crazed look that you see of someone that has 12 masks on, has taken 28 boosters. So clearly unhinged. But beyond the unhinged aspect of it, and we can forgive the mental illness because this past year and a half has done a lot for promoting mental illness among people. But what he is suggesting is something so anti-American and so beneath the dignity of the human being. He is suggesting that the military come around to your house, tie you down, and force you to take a shot in your arm. And think about how radical it is that someone like this can even be on a mainstream media outlet saying such unbelievably radical totalitarian things. It shows how far we've sunk, Dr. Paul.
Boy, there's no doubt about it. So it can get a little bit depressing at times, but if you put it in context of what history is all about and what has happened, the back and forth of people who want more liberty and less liberty, the more I study ancient history, the more I've become aware that these thoughts that we're dealing with actually existed thousands of years ago. It must have been born into the human race to deal with the issue of violence and the whole principle of looking for the truth of things. And that's what we're seeking here. And it seems like to get more people to seek the truth, whether it's on monetary policy or spending or whatever, or checking into Russiagate, the closer the people are to Washington and the more political they are, the more difficult time they get closer to finding out where the truth comes from. But I think that's what's happening here, and it's a lot of nonsense. So I talk to myself when I say this, because I never expected that tomorrow we're going to have a magic wand and everything's going to be okay and we're all going to love freedom. But I also know that if we don't have the principles in our mind and we don't have a goal, and that the principle doesn't exist of what liberty is all about and how important truth is, it can be a pretty bad world to live in. And I think there's ups and downs. And right now, I think our program today sort of expressed that, some ups and downs. The courts are moving in the right direction, doing the right things. At the same time, others in the midst of it all, they're just buckling down and doing more of the wrong things. But that should give us all encouragement. And I think sometimes these silly, ridiculous things they're doing, I just try to turn that around and say, people may be waking up, and I think that's what I did with these lockdowns. People aren't for these lockdowns, and when they're trying to be imposed at the state level, that's why some of these court cases are being won. People's minds are being shifted, and I think that is good to move in the direction of seeking out a voluntarist society, and for some of us to try to explain clearly that a society that depends on voluntarism isn't such a bad society. It happens to become a society that's much more peaceful and much more prosperous.
That is definitely the case, Dr. Paul. And I guess the one final thing we wanted to bring up, just briefly, I guess, is that Europe is still insane, and it's still very depressing, despite the fact that people are standing up. Hundreds of thousands of people are demonstrating constantly in Europe. It hasn't had an effect that we can see as of yet. Hopefully that will be the case. But in Greece, I mean, talk about discrimination, Dr. Paul, age discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. I think you've got the story on what they're doing over in Greece.
Right. They're saying that the people over 60 will be treated differently. They will have to wear a mask or they can't travel, really strong restrictions on them. And if they don't do it, they're going to be fined $118 every month. Now, I understand that some people in this country, $118 is nothing to worry about. But they say that's a significant amount. It's a huge penalty. But the whole idea, the thing that struck me on this, Daniel, is the fact that all of a sudden, I'm talking about universal type of liberty for all individuals, regardless of race, colored, creed, or age, or whatever. And every life is precious. But here it says they arbitrarily picked out and say, well, if you were born before 1960, you have more liberty than the others. And we've had other examples of this where they sort it out and they discriminate. So yes, some individuals do discriminate, and sometimes governments discriminate, and sometimes the people who pretend to be the most the best defenders of a fair society and no discrimination are the ones who do the most discrimination. So here it is, the left wing, this happens to be in Greece, but there's so often the people who think that, it's only conservatives and libertarians who allow discrimination to occur. Well, voluntarism isn't discrimination. It's a favorable process where people get to agree that nothing really happens in society unless two sides agree to it. And that's a contract. And I've been fascinated by reading Hammurabi and a few of the old codes. And they had this stuff in there. They had the principle of no lying and fraud, the principle of contracts. So it's not new. It's just right now we have drifted from this. And the contract, and to me, an imperfect contract is our Constitution. Some people follow it better than others, but there's a lot of people who think it's a joke, and they're so often we find those in Washington. So it's one thing, but I think this whole principle here is rather silly and dangerous because it reinforces the idea that liberty is to be divvied up, and it's being divvied up by government and by the ruthless authoritarians and by the people who gain power through ruthless means. And the wealth that they have and the power they have in politics actually can be very, very detrimental and can be the worst people in discrimination.
Yes. So in Greece, you must take the shot, or they'll devastate your personal wealth. What a wonderful place. Someone even commented that this is how Greece is dealing with the fact that they have no money left to pay the pensions. This is a ruse to avoid paying pensions. I wouldn't put it past them. But I'm gonna close out, Dr. Paul. I think we've exhausted our topics for today, and I'm just going to thank all of our viewers for watching the show and sticking with us. Reminding you again that you can subscribe for free to updates from the Ron Paul Institute. And again, we never sell or rent or loan your name out. Your information is private, just between us. I'll put a link in the description of how you can subscribe to updates. And trust me, we're not going to bombard you like some of them you get every day. We send you something maybe once a week, some thoughts on things that are happening, but we're not going to overwhelm you. So please subscribe, and so we can keep in touch. New rules have come down from Google about what you can say and can't say. And of course, they're always more onerous. They're always more threatening. So we literally don't know what will happen from one day to the next with this program. So that's just a good way for you to keep in touch if something happens to us. Dr. Paul, over to you.
Very, very good. And I too want to thank our viewers for tuning in and explain a little bit that our program appearance is a little bit different. And we've had to improvise because of some technical problem. But I was determined that I did not want to just come on when everything just was perfect. And I try to reach out and send out a message on what's going on for several reasons. There's a few people who still would like to hear what we're thinking at the Ron Paul Institute. And besides, there's a bit of enjoyment for me to visit with the individuals who care about this, dealing with people who are like-minded. I've always been fascinated when we've had conferences and all, how well the people get along and have fun and associate well with like-minded people. So that's one reason why we will keep up, during the holidays and all. We may be using Zoom and different facilities, but eventually we hope to actually improve our studio and present our case in a different type of atmosphere. But I do want to thank everybody for the support that you have given us, and please come back soon to the Liberty Report.